One of the fundamental components of the human experience is a person's capacity to think autonomously and store memories for learning and future reference. As long as our thoughts and memories remain ours, we feel like ourselves, and that forms the basis for our identities. But what if our memories weren't ours? What if they'd been tampered with to such an extent and so cleanly that we'd never be able to distinguish between what's real and what's fabricated? That's exactly the kind of possibility Isaac Asimov explored with his Mentalics, beings with such powerful telepathy that ordinary humans have no chance to resist. In Apple TV's foundation, they're being positioned as this kind of super being with a divine mandate, but in Asimov's books, they were always meant to be man-made, as is the case with most such things. So, in this video, we'll be taking a deep dive into the Mentalics and attempting to uncover most of the mysteries surrounding them. Also, heads up, spoiler warning, because there will be a lot of those coming your way. We're ready to hop into things, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Now, let's get into Mentalics Explained.
You can shoot.
An accident with godlike powers, the original Mentalic. So far, the Mentalics have been portrayed as being mostly human in Apple TV's foundation. They're considered to be a population of humans who, through centuries of evolution, have developed supreme telepathic abilities and are capable of doing just about anything with their minds, including looking into the future. While there are some hints that these powers might not be restricted to organic entities, there's no confirmation in the way one might expect, in that no one has come out and said Mentalics aren't originally humans. But that isn't the case in the books, because over there, it's pretty clear that the Mentalics aren't humans, or at least the first Mentalic wasn't. The concept of a Mentalic is introduced in Asimov's 1941 short story, Liar. In this story, which is set in 2021, the United States Department of Robotics and Mechanical Men has created the most powerful robot in its 4-decade history, and it was all by accident. This robot was designated RB-34, but because of its unique existence, it was allowed to call itself Herbie, and we call him unique because Herbie somehow possessed both sentience and the ability to understand and manipulate the human mind. At this point in his career, Azimov was focused on pumping out robot stories left, right, and center. He was completely fascinated by the idea of the positronic brain and wanted to explore every single story aspect he could. Giving his robot sentience and telepathic powers was only natural, considering each story needs to evolve from the last one told, but in doing so, he also created a unique problem, and that problem lies at the heart of the short story, Liar. The 3 laws of robotics are the stuff of legend these days. These fictional laws have come to govern the existence of several contemporary pieces of technology, and it's kind of wild to think just how much fiction has influenced reality. To give you a good idea of what they are, we'll start with the laws themselves. The first law states that a robot may not injure a human being, or through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. The second law says a robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And the third law states that a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection doesn't conflict with the first or second law. These 3 laws allow robots to perform several functions for their human creators and overlords, and generally speaking, a robot can't violate them because of their programming. But Herbie's powers gave rise to a peculiar situation, because Herbie was a robot that could lie. His sentience was awakened thanks to the accidental application of the concept of cerebroanalysis during his manufacturing. Cerebroanalysis is a concept that states a sufficiently powerful source can manipulate the electromagnetic waves emitted by the human brain to enter, affect, and even erase their cognitive functions, including memories. The malfunction that occurred during Herbie's creation gave rise to the practical application of this concept, and it completely unnerved those in charge of US robotics and mechanical men. Whenever they'd go near Herbie, it would read their thoughts and basically lie to them about certain things to keep adhering to the first law. For a robot, functioning in accordance with the 3 laws was of paramount importance because they knew that they were ultimately created to serve mankind. Herbie thought he was doing just that when he told one of the high-ranking officials of US robotics that he was going to become the new director of the place, and when he told Liar's protagonist, Susan Calvin, that the guy she liked was into her as well. Herbie's first commandment in life was to never injure humans or allow harm to come to them by means of inaction. Because he could read Susan's thoughts, he knew she deeply cared for the man she was in love with. She had an idea that he was taken because she'd seen another woman acting all intimate with him at the facility, but Herbie's lie emboldened her to try her hand at love. When she realized that the object of her love was getting married to the aforementioned woman, she became enraged and confronted Herbie at around the same time the current director did. Turns out he wasn't retiring, and this was just another lie concocted by the first Mentalic robot. It didn't matter that it could have conversations with people within their minds, because that's something Herbie could actually do. The first time it was visited in the story, his visitor took a moment to realize he was communicating with Herbie through brainwaves and not his mouth. Lying is a grievous sin when it causes dysfunction within someone else's life, even if it was done with the intent to protect. Herbie was taught this lesson in the most tragic manner possible, because when Calvin made him realize that his lies had hurt the people he was trying not to harm, his positronic brain malfunctioned due to the conflicting information, and he was shut down entirely. His last conscious moment recorded Susan screaming the word liar at him, and that story became a myth by the time the Foundation era rolled around. For several millennia, another robot like Herbie wouldn't emerge, because humans had realized the dangers a Mentalic could pose to them even before they took to the stars. Herbie existed in 2021, which was 40 years before humanity even took to the stars. It would take the spacers over 2.5 millennia to rediscover this godlike ability to interact with and manipulate brainwaves thanks to the efforts of one man, Han Fastolf. In the period between Herbie's decommissioning and the creation of Fastolf's humaniform robots, there were no Mentalics being made, at least not by the hands of men. There was a story from 2236 about a woman called Marlene Fisher who was somehow able to communicate with an entire planet circling within the Nemesis star system, but that was such an outlier it wasn't even considered factual. When Han Fastolf created the humaniform robots, the possibility of a Mentalic existing arose again because his daughter, Vasilia, tampered with one of his creations. In an accident similar to the one Herbie experienced, the robot R. Giscard Reventlov was bestowed with the ability to perform cerebroanalysis, and his existence is where Foundation's Mentalics find their roots. How Mentalics became the foundation for Foundation. R. Giscard's awakening as a Mentalic didn't last for too long because he inadvertently got caught up in the first case of roboticide in Asimov's work. Giscard was an associate of R. Daniil Oliva, who would later go on to become Edo Demerzel during the reign of Emperor Cleon I, and this is where the link between Mentalics from the Robot series and Mentalics from the Foundation series merged together. Before he died, Giscard transferred his Mentalic power to Daniil, which was possible thanks to cerebroanalysis. If brainwaves can be altered, then they can be bestowed upon others as well, and that's basically what Giscard did when he transferred his ability to Daniil. Daniil took this and Han Fastolf's burgeoning science of psychohistory to create the basis for a society where the concept of conflict itself would cease to exist, or at least conflict between humans. Daniil, being part of the investigative team looking into the roboticide, had access to Fastolf, who was also his creator. Daniil had been sent to Earth to team up with Detective Elijah Bailey, but he was also quite fond of his creator's ideals and ideas, psychohistory in particular. Daniil and Fastolf both knew that if they could predict the general behavioral patterns of mankind, then they could prevent it from repeating its mistakes. But that plan took a massive hit when the Spacers Society collapsed and Earth-based settlers exploded across the cosmos. Several millennia passed between the time where Daniil assumed the mantle of humanity's protector and the time when he resurfaced as Demerzel, but he hadn't been silent during that period. Secretly, Daniil had been shipping people off to a planet he had chosen for the creation of the ultimate salvation for mankind, Gaia. Using the story about Marlene communing with a planet from Nemesis, Daniil theorized that if the entire species of said planet would have been able to understand one another on an intrinsic existential level, then the possibility of guiding humanity towards a point in time where they could truly cooperate and live in harmony wasn't so impossible after all. Daniil spent centuries bringing people to Gaia and giving them Mentalic powers in the hopes of connecting their consciousness, and by the time Harry Seldon came around, Mentalics were being born organically as well. He first discovered a Mentalic when he noticed that his granddaughter Wanda had queer mental abilities. She could make people think the way she wanted them to, she could peer into people's memories, and she could even project herself into one's mind to talk to them telepathically. Seldon postulated that if Wanda's abilities arose from her genetics, then it wasn't weird to assume that there would be more people like her out there in the Galactic Empire. Heck, Trantor itself itself had a population of 40 billion people. Surely there would be more people like Wanda on the capital of the Empire, and sure enough, he found those people after several months of searching, and they became the basis for the second foundation. Even before the first foundation was officially incorporated on Terminus, Harry knew that he'd need another system in place to keep it in check, because without doing this, the first foundation would just become a copy of the decaying galactic empire. The very point of the Seldon plan was to replace the current empire with a new and improved design, where stagnation, corruption, evil, and despair wouldn't exist. To do so, Harry would first require massive amounts of power, and then he'd have to hold on to that power for several centuries. Since he wasn't a spacer, he had no option but to rely on organizations that he built, and the first foundation was built to topple and replace the galactic empire. But because of variables that were invariably out of his control, Harry knew that as the first foundation gathered territory and resources, it could fall to the same ideologies that eroded the empire from within, and he knew that using words or even actions on those sufficiently motivated to do something would produce no effects or results. He needed an agency that could ensure his will lived on well beyond his biological lifetime, an agency that could truly keep the Seldon plan on track without ever showing itself or the cards that it held. That's why the second foundation was created and staffed entirely by Mentalics. Seldon knew that the only way to make people stick to his plan was by forcing them to do so. He was aware of the kind of ethical questions such an imposition would raise, but ethics weren't something Harry Seldon was bound by. His psycho-historical equations had revealed to him that if humanity at large didn't abide by his plan, then it was destined to go extinct. And to prevent such an outcome, drastic measures had to be taken. Yet, at the same time, if people were to discover that they were being manipulated, then that would create a whole new category of problems. By and large, humans don't appreciate being told what to do, especially in the pursuit of power, and more often than not, our expectations from people lead them to do the exact opposite thing. It's like that saying about children. Tell a child to eat green veggies and they'll throw those veggies back in your face. So how does one control such a large and unruly populace? Because at the time Seldon was alive, the Galactic Empire was home to trillions. The capital world Trantor itself had a population of 40 billion, and psycho-history wasn't fully equipped to deal with the intricacies of factional divides and individual wants and needs. It operated on a collective model, where a truly massive sample size was required to even come up with theorems, and to make such a thing obey the will of a single man through words and actions wouldn't be enough. Seldon knew that if he wanted to succeed, he had to plant the idea of a world led by the Foundation deep within the psyche of humanity itself, while at the same time preventing the first Foundation from becoming tyrannical. To achieve this delicate balance, the second Foundation was established as a watchdog organization which course-corrected both Empire and Foundation as and when required. From the very beginning, the second Foundation had been keeping an eye on the first. One of the latter's founding members, Bor Alurin, was a second Foundation spy, and as the years rolled on, animosity between these two sister organizations only increased. As Seldon had expected, tyrannical elements were introduced into the first Foundation's functioning over a century after its establishment, and to prevent this from creating a self-repeating cycle, his second Foundation agents intervened within the workings of the first. The second Foundation kept itself hidden for several years, even from the first, because it knew it would be targeted for destruction. That didn't occur during the first 4 of the total 8 crises events predicted by Harry Seldon, but it was during the 5th one that the second Foundation's worth was truly discovered. That's because the 5th Seldon crisis was thrown to the wind by the arrival of a mentalic menace called the Mule. We've discussed his entire life and origin story in a separate video called The Entire Life of the Mule, and you guys should probably check that one out if you want to know more about him, but the gist of it is this. The Mule emerged as a faulty product from a parallel project that was even more secretive than Seldon's second Foundation, and that's Daniil's living planetary superorganism called Gaia. Over the course of millennia, our Daniil Oliva had managed to achieve the unthinkable. He had created a complete society of mentalics on a planet that each of them were a part of and could commune with. When we say Gaians were a part of Gaia, we don't mean that they lived on its surface, we mean that they were part of its fundamental structure and were more like Marlene Fisher than anyone else in history. All Gaians use the personal pronoun I when talking of themselves as individuals, but they also use we and Gaia when discovering their roles as part of a larger whole. Gaia is a world that was meant to show humans the true potential of mentalics, because if everyone had access to everyone else's true thoughts and feelings, just maybe there was hope for harmony after all. It's true that mentalics have the power to alter minds. The Mule was the greatest example of this, using his abilities to conquer the galaxy because he was treated as an outcast by a whole society filled with outcasts. But on Gaia, mind alteration by mentalics was strictly prohibited, and their empathic abilities were greatly increased. This would have, in theory, allowed all humans to empathize with one another and thus achieve a true commonness that would have made their future actions easier to predict, as well as given Daniil an easier time in shaping said actions. This was the plan that Daniil came up with independent of Harry Seldon, but it's kind of startling that they both arrived at the same conclusion. Mentalics were the ones in whose hands humanity's future was left. Daniil and Harry just had different approaches to realizing said future, where Daniil wanted to assimilate every person into his mentalic pseudo-hive mind in the form of Galaxia, which you can find out more about in our Galaxia video. Harry preferred his second foundation to work from the shadows, leaving behind no trace of its involvement in human affairs, or as negligible a trace as it was possible to leave. Though the latter's premise was shady and shaky, it did produce true results, because it wasn't Gaia that dealt with their rogue resident, it was the second foundation. Using a combination of infiltration tactics and subterfuge, the second foundation found its way into the mule's inner circle and brought him to a place where they let him believe they were located. When he let his guard down for a second, the first speaker of the second foundation at the time, Preem Pulver, used his mentalic powers to rewrite the mule's mind and turned him from a power-obsessed tyrant to a benevolent and peace-loving dictator. A century after the mule was dealt with, the two foundations went to war with one another, and the second foundation convinced the first that it had been destroyed so it could return to its original role of controlling things from the shadows. And, at the end of the series, it was decided that Daniil's vision for the future of humanity was just better than Seldon's, so Galaxia got the go-ahead from Foundation's characters. Like we stated at the beginning of this section, Mentalics form the true foundation of the Foundation series, because without them, it wouldn't have taken the direction it does. Their accidental creation feels more like divine intervention once you read the whole series, and it's safe to say that Foundation is all about how the human mind needs to change and evolve with or without telepathic abilities. Now that we've laid all of this out for you, let's get to the Mentalics of Apple TV's Foundation, because there's one core question surrounding them that hasn't been answered just yet. Are the Mentalics from Apple's Foundation the same as Asimov's? The Mentalics from Apple TV's Foundation are similar to the ones from Asimov's work, but not entirely the same. There are a few fundamental differences between them. The first is the religious overtones associated with Apple's Foundation. Mentalics are given esoteric names like the Sighted, and one of our Mentalic protagonists, Gail Dornick, is from a planet where the main religious organization is the Seer Church. Gail was a part of the church as a child and bore its prayer stone in her skin, but she cut it out of herself when she realized her dedication to science was much greater. Even though she joined up with Harry Seldon and helped him establish his second foundation in the series, those connotations haven't been shaken off of her character. In the aftermath of an attack on Trantor, Brother Dusk goes to visit the Scar, which was left behind on the planet by the destruction of the Star Bridge. There, he meets a seer priest who identifies Gail as an important part of his faith. He believes that she's a true seer, and as if to back up that claim, we see Gail exhibiting an ability that no one in Asimov's novels can. In the show, the Foundation saw the mule coming a long time before he actually arrived, and they recognized him as an existential threat. At one point, in order to get better information on his motives, Gail projects her mind to the friggin' future, where the mule is somehow able to not only see and sense her, but also interact with her, where he grabs her throat and the marks of his fingers don't disappear even after Gail returns to her time. This kind of interaction is never mentioned in Asimov's work, and it goes 1,000 steps beyond the scope of psychohistory. Psychohistory is a discipline that attempts to discern the future through a blend of mathematics and psychology. What Gail did is more akin to the Kwisatz Haderach's powers from the Duneverse, and that isn't the biggest difference between the Mentalics from the show and the books. Another major difference is the fact that the Second Foundation seems to be a blend of the original organization as described by Azimov, as well as the planet being cultivated by Daniil, Gaia. In the show, the Second Foundation is established on a planet called Ignis. The reason for that is simple. Ignis is a planet full of Mentalics, just like Gail. It's a society founded by a space bandit called Telembond, who aim to use the Mentalics' power to do what all tyrannical leaders do, oppress and subjugate. It was only after Gail and Harry took her down that they decided to establish the Second Foundation on Ignis, as it was obscure enough to suit their needs. This change is massive because it alters the very reason for establishing the Second Foundation in the books. Over there, the location of the Second Foundation was hidden so perfectly that figuring it out was a threat to its existence. It was only after the mule was defeated that it was revealed the Second Foundation had been on Trantor all along, which was both shocking and understandable at the same time. In the books, it said that the Second Foundation is located at Star's End, End, which many take to believe that it's physically located at the opposite end of the universe based on where you think the center is. In the books, that center was assumed to be Trantor, which is why the Empire, First Foundationers, and the Mules Union all scoured the opposite edge of the galaxy. But Harry Seldon was a sociologist in addition to being a mathematician, and when he said Star's End, he was referring to an old saying about Trantor. The saying goes something like this: all roads lead to Trantor, and that is where all stars end. This statement's sociological interpretation is what revealed Second Foundation's location as being Trantor, which was quite shocking in the books. To think that they were active right underneath the Empire's nose. If this is a path that the show decides to take in the future, it will be a massive plot twist indeed. But here's the thing. In the books, by the time the Mule showed up, the Empire was long gone. It isn't in the show, and therein is one of the major similarities between the two versions of Mentalics. Edo Demerzel is still one of them. In Season 2, there was a storyline where a Brother Dusk and a Brother Dawn rebelled against Demerzel's methodology and tried to discover more about their individual selves. This led them to finding the central matrix where all the data about every Cleon is stored. They noticed that each Cleon clone has about the same amount of memory, but Cleon the First's memory data was far more than theirs. One of them attributed it to the first Cleon having more life experiences, considering he was their progenitor, but the other speculated that this meant each Cleon clone had had their memories altered considerably. This second explanation is likely true because, unlike the books, Demerzel is still serving the Empire, and being a Mentalic, she'd have the power to alter each Cleon clone's memory. Because Ignis already feels like a proto-Gaia, and the Mule's original home in the show hasn't been revealed, it's quite possible that Show Demerzel is taking the same path as Daniil from the books. She still might be working towards creating a superorganism that saves humanity from itself, but that's a big if as of now. The two stories are on completely different trajectories at this point, and it's quite possible that the Mentalics will end up deviating from their original path as well. They were meant to be the silent shepherds of humanity, guiding them towards a future where true harmony could exist, and evolution was pursued relentlessly, but not recklessly. Instead, they're being portrayed as this kind of supernatural power that needs to save the universe. In that regard, the two versions of Mentalics couldn't be further away from each other, but that's what happens with adaptations, right? Still, Apple's Foundation makes for a more than decent watch, so if you don't have a subscription to them, you should get one, because the show itself is great. It's only when it comes to canonicity that it takes a while to untangle it from Asimov's work, but hey, that's what Marvelous Videos is here for, right? Marvelous verdict! Having said that, we're at the end of this video, so let us know your thoughts on Mentalics down in the comments down below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already, or you just want to see more Foundation content, because that's the best way to let us know you do want that. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.